The moment the scissors touched her hair, the room went silent. 20 children sat frozen in place, their eyes locked on the front of the classroom as strands of thick curls fell slowly to the polished floor. The little girl didn't scream at first. She just stared, as if her mind couldn't quite understand what was happening to her. Then came the second cut, sharper than the first, and that's when the sound broke through. A cry, small and trembling, filled the room, and still, no one moved. The teacher stood firm, her grip steady, her expression unchanged, convinced she was correcting something that needed to be fixed. To her, this was discipline. To everyone else, it felt like something far worse. And in that moment, as the final strands dropped from the child's head, something else began, something no one in that room could have prepared for. Because what looked like a simple act of control would, within the hour, turn into a chain of events that would shake the entire school, expose secrets no one expected, and leave one question hanging over everyone involved. Who exactly had they just crossed? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time the last bell echoed through the halls that afternoon, the classroom had already returned to its quiet routine, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the silence felt different now, heavier, almost watchful. The girl walked out slower than the others, her head lowered, her steps uncertain, holding herself together in a way no child should ever have to. A few students glanced at her, then quickly looked away, unsure of what they had just witnessed or what it meant. Down the corridor, security cameras blinked steadily, recording everything without judgment, without intervention. Outside, the long driveway leading away from the school stretched into stillness, where dark-tinted vehicles would soon appear, unannounced and uninvited, carrying with them a response no one had anticipated. At first glance, it would have been easy to assume this was just another strict teacher enforcing outdated rules, another student quietly enduring something she didn't fully understand. But there were details that didn't quite fit, things that didn't sit right when looked at closely. The girl had never caused trouble. She wasn't disruptive, she wasn't defiant, and yet she had been singled out in a way that felt deliberate, which raised a question no one inside that building was asking yet. Why her? And even more importantly, who was she really outside the walls of that classroom? Because while the teacher believed she had handled a minor issue, what she didn't know was that the child she had just humiliated lived in a world far removed from school rules and written policies, a world where actions carried consequences far beyond detention slips or parent meetings. And then there was what happened after school, the part no one saw coming, the part that would unfold quietly at first, almost unnoticed, before shifting into something far more serious. A phone call, a pause, a single question repeated more than once, and then movement, calculated, precise, and impossible to stop once it began. The kind of response that doesn't come from anger alone, but from something deeper, something controlled and deliberate. By the time anyone realized the situation had escalated, it was already in motion, and there was no simple way to reverse it. So now the questions begin to take shape. Who was the girl beyond that classroom, beyond the tears and the silence? What pushed the teacher to go that far, to cross a line that most wouldn't even approach? And what exactly happened after school that day that would leave an entire institution shaken to its core? Because the answers to those questions don't start in that classroom. They start much earlier, long before the scissors, long before the silence, long before anyone realized the weight of what had just been set in motion. To understand what happened, we have to go back. Long before that classroom fell silent, before the sound of steel against hair turned a normal school day into something no one would forget, there were lives moving in quiet, predictable patterns, each one unaware of how closely they were about to collide. The girl, whose name was Ava, had only been at the school for a few months. To most people, she was easy to overlook at first glance. She didn't demand attention, didn't disrupt lessons, didn't push boundaries the way some children did. She listened, she learned, and she carried herself with a quiet kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. But there was one thing about her that stood out, something impossible to ignore no matter how still she tried to remain, and that was her hair. Thick, full, carefully cared for. It framed her face in a way that reflected something deeper than appearance. It was identity, it was pride, And whether she fully understood it or not, it was a connection to something larger than the classroom she sat in every day. At home, her mornings followed a rhythm that felt safe and familiar. She would sit patiently, sometimes swinging her feet, sometimes fidgeting just enough to draw a quiet correction, while her father worked carefully through her hair. His hands, despite their size and strength, moved with precision and restraint, as if he understood that what he was doing mattered far beyond the surface. He never rushed. He took his time, parting, smoothing, shaping, making sure every detail was just right before she left for school. To him, it wasn't just a routine. It was a promise, one he had made long ago, though few people knew the full weight behind it. He didn't talk much during those moments, but when he did, his voice softened in a way that few ever heard. It was a side of him that didn't exist anywhere else. Most people who encountered him outside that home saw something entirely different. He was known as a businessman, someone who operated in spaces where influence mattered more than visibility. He wasn't loud, he wasn't boastful, and he didn't seek attention. His presence alone carried enough weight to command respect without explanation. Meetings ended when he decided they were over. Conversations shifted the moment he spoke. People listened, not because they were asked to, but because they understood, on some level, that ignoring him was not an option. Most people saw a businessman. Very few knew what he actually controlled. And fewer still understood how far that control extended when something, or someone, crossed a line that should never have been touched. The school Ava attended stood in sharp contrast to the life she returned to each day. It was an institution built on tradition, a place where rules were rarely questioned and appearances were treated as reflections of discipline and order. The hallways were lined with history, photographs of past students, achievements carefully framed, a quiet reminder that this was a place where standards were not just expected but enforced. There was a structure to everything, from the uniforms to the way students were expected to carry themselves, and within that structure existed an unspoken hierarchy that shaped how people were seen and how they were treated. Some fit into that system naturally. Others stood out in ways that made them difficult to ignore. Ava, whether intentionally or not, fell into that second group. It wasn't her behavior that set her apart, nor was it her performance in class. It was something far less tangible, something that couldn't be corrected with a warning or a grade. And for one person in particular, that difference became impossible to overlook. The teacher had spent years within those walls, long enough to believe she understood exactly how things should be. She wasn't loud, she didn't raise her voice unnecessarily, and she didn't act without reason, at least not in her own mind. She believed in order, in discipline, in maintaining a standard that she felt was slowly being ignored. To her, it wasn't about being harsh or unfair. It was about preserving something she thought was slipping away. She didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as necessary. And when she looked at Ava, she didn't see a child simply existing as she was. She saw a disruption, something that needed to be corrected before it became something else. At first, it was subtle. A comment here, a suggestion there, small remarks delivered in a tone that could easily be mistaken for concern. Nothing overt enough to draw attention, nothing that could be easily challenged, but enough to make Ava pause, enough to make her wonder if she had done something wrong without realizing it. The notes followed soon after, written carefully, framed as guidance, each one reinforcing the same idea in slightly different ways. They never reached her father. Ava made sure of that, though she couldn't fully explain why. Maybe she didn't want to cause trouble. Maybe she believed, in some quiet corner of her mind, that if she just listened, if she just adjusted, things would go back to normal. But they didn't, because what started as comments didn't stay that way. And what the teacher believed she was correcting was slowly turning into something far more deliberate, something that was building, step by step, toward a moment that would change everything for both of them. At first, it was just comments. The comments didn't stop after that. They became routine, almost expected, delivered in a tone that never rose high enough to be questioned, but carried just enough weight to linger long after the moment passed. At first, they were framed as reminders. A slight tilt of the head, a quiet remark about presentation, a suggestion that something needed to be managed better. Each time, Ava nodded, her voice soft, her posture careful, trying to adjust in ways that didn't make sense to her, but felt necessary to avoid standing out any further. The teacher never raised her voice, never caused a scene that could be easily pointed to as wrong. Instead, she operated within the space between authority and assumption, where actions could be justified if no one looked too closely. The notes became more frequent after that, folded neatly into planners, written in precise handwriting, each one carrying the same message in slightly different words. Concerns about neatness, observations about distractions, suggestions that change was needed. They were addressed to her father, but they never made it that far. Ava would pause before leaving school, glance at the paper for a moment, and then quietly discard it. It wasn't fear that stopped her from bringing them home, at least not in the way most would think. It was something quieter, a hesitation rooted in the hope that maybe it would pass if she didn't make it bigger than it already felt. She didn't want to bring that tension into the one place that still felt safe. Inside the classroom, the dynamic began to shift in ways that were harder to ignore. What had once been quiet remarks started to take on a more public form. The teacher would pause during lessons, redirecting attention with carefully chosen words that placed Ava at the center without ever fully calling it out as such. A comment about visibility, a suggestion that others were being affected. It was always framed as concern for the group, never as a direct accusation, but the effect was the same. Heads would turn, even if only briefly. Eyes would linger just long enough to make Ava aware of them before quickly returning to their work. No one laughed. No one spoke out. But the silence carried its own kind of pressure. Ava responded the only way she knew how. She became smaller in her seat, more aware of her movements, more careful about where she placed herself in the room. She adjusted her posture, shifted slightly when she could, trying to anticipate what might draw attention before it happened. But there was no clear rule she could follow, no exact change she could make that would resolve what the teacher seemed to see as a problem. And that uncertainty made it impossible to fix. For the teacher, each of these moments reinforced something she had already decided. In her mind, she wasn't targeting a child. She was correcting a pattern, addressing something she believed had been overlooked. She convinced herself that the lack of resistance meant she was right, that the quiet compliance she received was proof that her actions were justified. And with each passing day, that belief became more fixed, more certain, until there was no room left for doubt. What made it more complicated was how normal everything else seemed. Lessons continued. Assignments were completed. The structure of the day remained unchanged. To anyone outside that classroom, there was nothing to suggest that anything unusual was happening. No reports, no complaints, no visible conflict that demanded attention. It existed in small moments, in passing remarks, in the space between what was said and what was meant. Ava carried it quietly, the way children often do when they don't yet have the words to explain what they're feeling. She didn't fully understand why it was happening, only that it was. And with each passing day, the gap between how she saw herself and how she was being seen in that room grew wider, harder to reconcile. Then came the moment when routine shifted into something else entirely. It didn't happen suddenly, at least not in a way that anyone could have predicted in advance. It built gradually, shaped by everything that had come before, until the line that had once seemed clear was no longer visible at all. The teacher had convinced herself that she was maintaining order, that she was doing what needed to be done to preserve a standard she believed in. And in that belief, she made a choice. But then she made a decision that crossed a line no one could undo. The moment didn't begin with shouting or chaos. It started quietly, almost like any other interruption. The teacher paused mid-lesson, her voice cutting through the stillness with a calm authority that had never been questioned before. She called Ava's name, not loudly, but firmly enough that every head in the room lifted at once. Ava looked up, her expression uncertain, her hands still resting on the edges of her book. For a brief second, nothing moved. Then the teacher stepped closer, her gaze fixed, her posture rigid, as if she had already made a decision long before this moment arrived. When she reached for Ava's wrist, it wasn't frantic or rushed. It was deliberate. Her fingers closed tightly, guiding her out of the chair and toward the front of the room. The movement was controlled, but there was no mistaking the force behind it. Ava stumbled slightly as she stood, her balance thrown off more by confusion than resistance. The other students watched, frozen in place, unsure whether this was discipline or something else entirely. No one spoke. No one intervened. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as Ava was positioned near the desk, her small frame rigid with tension. The teacher turned away briefly, opening the top drawer with a quiet pull. For a moment, all that could be heard was the faint scrape of wood against wood. Then her hand emerged holding something that didn't belong in that context, something that shifted the entire atmosphere of the room without a single word being spoken. The scissors caught the light as they were lifted, their presence alone enough to make a few students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ava's eyes widened, her breath catching as she instinctively tried to step back, but the grip on her wrist tightened just enough to keep her in place. There was a pause then, a long, suspended second where it felt like something might still stop this from happening. Ava's voice broke through first, soft and pleading, asking her to stop, trying to explain in the only way she knew how. But the teacher didn't respond. She positioned herself behind Ava, gathering a section of her hair with one hand, the other holding the scissors steady. The room seemed to shrink in that moment, every detail narrowing down to that single point of contact. When the blades closed for the first time, the sound was sharper than anyone expected. It cut through the silence in a way that felt final, impossible to ignore. A thick section of hair loosened instantly, falling away as if it had been severed from more than just the scalp. Ava gasped, her hands instinctively rising too late, her body trembling as the reality of what was happening began to set in. A few students turned their faces away. Others stared, unable to look elsewhere, caught between shock and disbelief. The teacher didn't stop. She adjusted her grip, moving to the other side with the same measured control, as if completing something she had already justified in her mind. Ava's voice broke again, louder this time, the fear no longer contained, her words dissolving into cries that echoed through the room. The second cut followed, just as precise, just as deliberate. More hair fell, landing beside the first, the soft strands gathering on the floor in a way that felt painfully out of place. When the teacher finally released her, it was abrupt, almost dismissive, as if the act itself required no further acknowledgement. Ava stood there for a second, unsteady, her hands moving up to her head, touching what was left, trying to understand what had been taken from her. Then her knees gave way, and she dropped to the floor, her body folding in on itself as the weight of it all came crashing down. She reached for the fallen strands, clutching them tightly, her sobs filling the space that had once been silent. No one spoke. The room remained still, the air thick with something no one knew how to name. And in that moment, everything changed. By the time the final bell rang, the school had already begun to empty, the noise of the day fading into scattered footsteps and distant conversations. Students poured out in groups, their energy returning as they left the structure of the classroom behind. But Ava didn't move with them. She waited until the room had nearly cleared before standing, her movements slow, careful, as if drawing as little attention to herself as possible. Her head remained lowered, her shoulders slightly hunched, and though her face was partially hidden, the damage was impossible to miss for anyone who looked closely enough. When she finally stepped outside, the late afternoon light hit her in a way that made everything feel exposed, and instinctively, she pulled her hood up, trying to shield herself from the world around her. The car was already waiting. It always was, parked just far enough from the main entrance to avoid the rush. Its presence was quiet but unmistakable. The driver stood beside it, posture straight, eyes scanning the flow of students with a focus that never seemed to waver. He was used to routines, to patterns, to recognizing when something was out of place. And the moment he saw Ava, he knew something was wrong. She wasn't running toward him the way she usually did. She wasn't smiling, wasn't waving, wasn't calling out. Instead, she moved slowly, each step measured, as if carrying something heavier than her small frame should allow. He opened the door without a word, watching as she climbed into the back seat and curled inward, her face turned away. For a moment, he didn't speak. He simply closed the door, walked around, and settled into the driver's seat. The silence that followed was different from the quiet of routine. It was heavier, filled with something unspoken that demanded attention. He adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, just enough to catch a clearer glimpse of her reflection. That's when he saw it. The uneven edges. The missing volume. The way her hands trembled as they hovered near her head, but never quite touched it. He turned fully then, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. "Ava, what happened?" She didn't answer at first. Her shoulders shook slightly, her breath uneven, as if she was trying to hold something back, but couldn't. When she finally spoke, the words came broken, barely steady enough to form a sentence. She told him what happened in pieces, each one landing heavier than the last. The classroom, the teacher, the scissors, the moment she couldn't stop. There was a pause after that. Not confusion, not disbelief, just silence, the kind that settles before something shifts. He reached for his phone, his movements precise, already knowing who needed to hear this. The call connected quickly. On the other end, her father answered with the same calm presence he carried into every conversation, his voice steady, measured, as if nothing could disrupt it. "Yes." The driver didn't rush his words. He didn't exaggerate. He simply told him. Every detail, exactly as it happened. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Then came the question. Who did this? There was a brief hesitation, just enough for the weight of it to settle. The teacher. Silence again. Then, quieter, colder. Repeat that. The driver did. This time slower. When the line went still again, it wasn't uncertainty. It was something else entirely. The kind of stillness that comes before action, before decisions are made and set into motion without hesitation. Nothing in his voice had risen. There was no anger, no raised tone, nothing that would suggest what was building beneath the surface. And somehow, that made it worse. Because in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. What happened next was something no one at that school could have predicted. The call ended without another word, and for a brief moment, everything remained exactly as it was. The car idled. The school grounds looked no different from any other afternoon. Staff members gathered their belongings. A few students lingered near the entrance, and the routine carried on as if nothing had shifted. But the change had already begun, quietly, beyond the awareness of anyone inside those walls. It didn't arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived with timing. The first vehicle turned into the road leading to the school less than 15 minutes later. It didn't speed, didn't draw attention, didn't break any rules that would make it stand out. It simply moved with purpose, followed shortly by another, and then another, each one maintaining distance, each one arriving as if by coincidence rather than coordination. To anyone glancing out from a window, it might have looked like nothing more than a series of routine arrivals. But there was nothing routine about the way they positioned themselves once they reached the perimeter. At the main gate, the usual flow of cars slowed, then stopped entirely. A brief exchange took place, quiet and controlled, and within moments, access was restricted. Not forcefully, not aggressively, but firmly enough that no one questioned it outright. Inside, a few staff members noticed the shift almost immediately. Conversations paused. A glance toward the entrance turned into a second look. Something about the stillness outside didn't match the time of day, didn't fit the pattern they were used to. It wasn't panic that spread through the building. It was uncertainty. In the administrative office, a call was attempted, then another, both ending without the expected response. Lines that should have connected didn't, and explanations that would normally come quickly were absent. Teachers began to notice small disruptions in routine. Doors that were usually open remained closed. Movement in the hallways became more deliberate, less casual. No one had been told anything directly, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Outside, the vehicles remained in place, engines running, drivers unmoving. There was no shouting, no visible confrontation, nothing that would suggest urgency to an untrained eye. But every position had been chosen carefully, every angle accounted for. Entry points were observed. Exits were covered. It wasn't about creating a scene. It was about control. Inside the car, Ava sat quietly, her earlier sobs now reduced to soft, uneven breaths. The driver didn't turn around again. He didn't need to. He already knew what was happening, even if he couldn't see it directly. He had seen this pattern before. This shift from calm to action that unfolded without warning, but followed a structure that never failed. It didn't rely on emotion. It relied on certainty. Back at the school, confusion continued to build, but it never crossed into chaos. Staff members moved with caution, unsure of what they were responding to, but aware that something required their attention. A few students waiting for late pickups glanced toward the gates, sensing the change without fully understanding it. Questions were asked, but answers didn't come. And at the center of it all, the teacher remained where she had been, unaware of the scale of what had been set in motion. The classroom was quiet again, the earlier incident already filed away in her mind as resolved, handled, complete. She had returned to her work, her focus intact, her belief unchanged. To her, the day had continued as expected. But outside those walls, something far more deliberate was unfolding. There was no rush, no wasted movement, no hesitation. Every step followed the last with quiet precision, building toward a moment that would bring everything to a stop. This wasn't anger. This was precision. By the time the hallway outside the classroom fell completely quiet, the shift had already reached its final stage. The footsteps that approached were measured, unhurried, each one echoing just enough to announce presence without demanding attention. The door didn't swing open with force. It moved steadily, almost respectfully, as if what was about to happen required no theatrics to carry its weight. When Ava's father stepped inside, he didn't scan the room like someone searching for answers. He already knew exactly where to look. The teacher looked up, her expression tightening slightly at the interruption, more irritated than concerned at first. To her, this was unexpected, but not threatening. She had dealt with parents before, handled complaints, defended her decisions. She straightened her posture, ready to explain, ready to justify, ready to maintain control of the situation she believed was still hers. But as he walked closer, that confidence began to shift. There was something in the way he moved, something in the stillness he carried with him, that didn't match anything she had encountered before. He stopped a few steps from her desk, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, completely controlled. There was no anger in it, no raised tone, nothing that could be pointed to as aggression. And yet, every word carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. "You're the one who touched her." It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. The teacher opened her mouth to respond, to explain the situation as she understood it, to frame her actions within the rules she believed she was enforcing. She spoke of standards, of order, of maintaining a certain level of presentation within the classroom. Her voice was steady at first, practiced, shaped by years of authority that had rarely been challenged in any meaningful way. He listened without interrupting. Not once. And when she finished, expecting resistance, expecting argument, expecting something she could push back against, he simply reached into his jacket and placed a thin folder on her desk. The motion was calm, deliberate. He opened it and turned it toward her without a word. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then recognition set in, slow but unmistakable. Documents she never expected anyone to see. Records she believed were buried deep enough to remain untouched. Details of transactions, decisions, patterns she had kept hidden beneath the surface of her professional image. Her composure faltered, just slightly, but enough to be seen. "You've been very careful," he said quietly, "but not careful enough." She tried to recover, to regain the footing she felt slipping away beneath her. She spoke again, this time less certain, less controlled, attempting to redirect, to shift focus back to the classroom, to the incident, to anything that would restore the balance she had just lost. But the space for that was gone. He stepped closer, not invading her space, but close enough that she could no longer ignore the difference between them. The authority she had relied on, the structure that had supported her for years, began to feel distant, irrelevant in the face of something far more absolute. "You thought she was unprotected." The words settled heavily, leaving no room for interpretation. For the first time, the teacher's confidence broke completely. Not because of volume, not because of force, but because of certainty. She realized, in that moment, that she had misjudged something fundamental. Not just the situation, but the person standing in front of her and what he represented. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Instead, he laid out the reality of her position with quiet clarity. The choices she had made, the lines she had crossed, the consequences that followed not out of anger, but out of balance being restored. There was no spectacle, no dramatic display. Just the removal of everything she believed protected her. The room felt different now. Smaller, quieter, final. And for the first time since she had picked up those scissors, the teacher understood exactly what she had set in motion. By the time the sun began to set, the tension that had gripped the school started to fade. but its impact lingered in ways that couldn't be easily erased. Conversations would come later, explanations would be attempted, and policies would likely be reviewed, but none of that mattered in the moment that followed. Because miles away from that building, in a place far removed from structured hallways and controlled environments, Ava sat quietly in a space that felt safe again. The silence there was different. It didn't carry fear or uncertainty. It allowed her to breathe. Her father entered the room without urgency, closing the distance between them in the same measured way he had approached everything else that day. But the presence he carried now was not the same one that had walked into that classroom. The control remained. The precision was still there, but something had softened. He sat beside her without speaking at first, giving her the space to settle, to feel, to exist without pressure. When she finally looked up, there was hesitation in her eyes, a quiet question she didn't know how to ask. He reached out slowly, not to fix anything immediately, not to undo what had been done, but simply to reassure her that nothing essential had been taken. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, but warmer than before, shaped by something far more personal than the events of the day. "They didn't take anything from you," he said. "Not the part that matters." Ava listened, her breathing still uneven but beginning to steady. She raised her hand slightly, touching what remained of her hair, as if trying to understand how that could be true. He didn't rush to explain it away. He didn't pretend it hadn't hurt. Instead, he acknowledged it in the only way that mattered. "What you have isn't something anyone can cut away," he continued. "It's not something they control." The words didn't erase what had happened, but they shifted something. The weight she had been carrying since that moment in the classroom didn't disappear, but it became easier to hold. She leaned closer, resting against him, the tension in her body slowly releasing as the certainty of his presence settled around her. In that space, the contrast became clear. What had been taken with force was being met with something stronger, something steady and unshaken. The world she had been pulled into earlier that day no longer defined the moment she was in now. And while the memory would remain, it would not be the thing that shaped her. Outside, the world would continue as it always did, moving forward, adjusting, forgetting pieces of what had happened. But for Ava, and for the man sitting beside her, the lesson had already been made clear in a way that required no further explanation. Some people mistake silence for weakness until it's too late. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have handled it the same way, or taken a different path when the line was crossed? And more importantly, do you believe the teacher deserved what happened in the end, or did things go further than they should have? It's a difficult question, one that doesn't have a simple answer. And that's exactly why stories like this stay with us long after they're over. Because they force us to think, to reflect, and to decide where we stand when power, responsibility, and consequence all collide in a single moment. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your perspective matters more than you think. And if you found this story gripping, if it kept you watching and thinking all the way through, make sure you subscribe, because the next one might be even more shocking.